The morning air carried a kind of silence that only military cemeteries know, the kind made of discipline and ghosts. The flags at Arlington moved just enough to whisper, and the sound of boots on gravel echoed like memory itself. That's when he arrived. John Miller, 87 years old, wearing the only suit he owned. The fabric was old, pressed as neatly as arthritic fingers allowed. His shoes were polished, not perfectly, but with intention. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane that had seen as much history as he had. His shoulders were slightly bent, not from weakness, but from the weight of years spent carrying more than most men could bear. Ahead of him stood two young guards at the main gate. Fresh faces, crisp uniforms, eyes still sharp with the kind of pride that doesn't yet understand humility. "Sir," one of them said, his tone clipped, impersonal, "this is a private ceremony, General Wallace's funeral, invitation only." He didn't look up from his clipboard. To him, the old man was just another civilian, lost, maybe confused. John didn't answer right away. He looked past the guard, toward the green rolling hills where white headstones lined the earth like pages in an endless book. The younger guard sighed, impatient. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to step aside. The motorcade's coming. You're holding things up." John finally spoke, his voice steady, low, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "I'm here for the general. He'd want me here." The other guard, barely out of his 20s, smirked. "You and the general were friends, huh?" His words were meant as a joke, but they landed like a slap. John didn't react. He'd been underestimated before, by men who hadn't yet seen how fragile life becomes when you've looked it in the eye too many times. "Name?" the first guard asked, still not looking at him. "John Miller." The name meant nothing to them. No rank, no medals, no ribbons. Just another old man claiming to belong where he didn't. "Sir," the guard said, this time louder, "you're not on the list." John nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something he already knew. He looked down at the small, crooked pin on his lapel, a dull piece of metal, no bigger than a dime. It wasn't official, it wasn't regulation, but to him it meant more than any star, stripe, or cross ever could. The guards didn't notice. They only saw a man too old to matter standing where he didn't belong. Behind them a line of black sedans rolled up. Flags on hoods, tinted windows, the kind of ceremony that belonged to generals and men with power. John didn't move. He'd learned long ago that standing still can sometimes be the loudest thing you can do. "Sir," the second guard said, now irritated, "if you don't leave, we'll have to remove you." John's answer was simple. "Then do what you have to do." It wasn't defiance. It was truth from a man who had seen enough of life to know that sometimes rules break before honor does. The guards exchanged glances, unsure. The younger one stepped closer, trying to make his presence a wall. "Look, Grandpa," he said with a forced laugh, "you can visit the public section down the road, but this is for the real soldiers." And that's when something changed in the air. A silence heavier than the one before fell between them, the kind that warns you that you've just crossed a line. John didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply looked the young man in the eye, and for a brief second, that soldier felt the weight of every war he had never fought, staring back at him. The younger guard's words hung in the air, like the echo of a misfired round, too late to take back, too sharp to ignore. John's gaze didn't waver. His eyes were pale, clouded with age, but they carried the kind of depth that comes only from looking at both heaven and hell, often on the same day. For a brief moment, the young man looked away. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way John stood. Not tall, not proud, just unyielding. John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch, the fabric worn smooth over time. He loosened the string and tilted it open in his palm. Inside lay a single, faded pin, bronze, scratched and dull. "This," he said quietly, "wasn't handed out at parades. You earned it when the noise stopped, and only the breathing was left." He didn't explain more. He didn't have to. The guards stared at it, confused. It wasn't an official insignia, not one they'd been trained to recognize. To them, it looked like a trinket from a pawn shop, maybe a souvenir from a forgotten battle. But to men who knew, to those who had been there, it was unmistakable. A mark given to a handful of soldiers during one of the bloodiest rescues of the Vietnam War, a rescue that never made it to the evening news. John had been part of that operation, a mission so deep in enemy territory that even their own command doubted they'd return. Out of 37 men, only 8 came back. He was one of them. The general, Wallace, had been another. They'd shared more than service. They'd shared silence, the kind of silence that follows you for decades, the kind that never fully leaves. John closed his hand over the pin again. "He wouldn't have left me outside." The guard shifted uneasily. For the first time, they didn't know what to do. The older one, perhaps sensing the wrongness of the situation, lifted his radio. "Command, this is Post 3. We've got an elderly civilian claiming relation to General Wallace. Name's John Miller. Says he served with him." Static answered. Then a voice crackled back. "Negative. No civilians authorized. Keep perimeter clear." Orders. Always the same. John didn't argue. He just stood still, eyes fixed beyond them, where the sound of a bugle began to rise. That sound, the opening notes of taps, had been part of his life. He'd heard it for brothers who never got back up. And now it was playing for the man who once dragged him through a jungle under gunfire. Something inside him tightened. He wasn't angry. Anger was for the young. He was just anchored. He took one step forward. The younger guard's hand shot out instinctively. "Sir, I said—" But before he could finish, a new voice cut through the air. Sharp, commanding. The kind that carried weight even before the stars on the shoulder came into view. "Stand down, soldier." Both guards froze. From the black sedan near the front of the procession, a man in full dress uniform had stepped out. Tall, silver-haired, with 4 stars glinting faintly beneath the gray sky. The crowd fell silent. He walked straight toward John. No hesitation, no security detail stopping him. Just purpose. The guard straightened, unsure whether to salute or disappear. The general stopped in front of John and looked at him for a long, long moment, and then, quietly, did something no one expected. He saluted. It wasn't quick, it wasn't symbolic. It was deliberate, personal, the kind of salute given from one soldier to another. Spring arrived late that year, cautious and thin, like someone knocking before entering. The snow melted in stubborn layers, and the roads returned one crack at a time. Lantern's Rest had survived the winter, not by luck, but by the slow rhythm of human hands that refused to stop helping. Alma's world became smaller but deeper. She still opened the diner before dawn, brewed the same coffee, arranged the same silverware, but there was something new in the air, a quiet pattern that no one could quite explain. People came not just to eat, but to pause, A tired truck driver stayed longer over breakfast. An old woman from town started bringing her knitting just to sit in the warmth. A young man cleaned the snow off the steps before leaving. It wasn't charity. It was recognition, the wordless kind that passes between people who've seen enough of the world to know how fragile comfort is. At the clinic across town, Alma volunteered a few hours a week. They called the small space she helped organize the Room of Slowness. The walls were soft green, the clock ran 2 minutes late on purpose, and there were no forms to fill. People came there to learn how to move gently, how to lift a shoulder without hurting it, how to feed someone with patience instead of hurry, how to care without erasing yourself. Alma didn't teach with words. She demonstrated, gesture by gesture, as if time itself were a muscle that needed rehabilitation. Her own joints ached, but she didn't hide it. Her hands shook slightly when she poured tea, and that trembling taught others more than any lecture, that even unsteady hands can still give warmth. Lantern's Rest began to change too. The tables were rearranged to make space for wheelchairs. Hooks for canes appeared near every booth. The back door, which used to jam in the cold, was replaced with one that closed softly, almost politely. Nobody called it a renovation. They just said, "It feels easier to breathe here now." Small notes started appearing around town. On the library bench, "For those who walk slower today." On a bus stop, "Light stays longer when you share it." On Lantern's Rest's front window, "Here, everyone belongs." No one signed them, but Alma recognized the handwriting. Patient, careful, almost medicinal. The same block letters as the biker's note months earlier. She smiled. Kindness, she thought, is a language that doesn't need a teacher, only someone willing to keep speaking it. The funeral ended the way all military funerals do, with precision, grace, and an ache that no ceremony could ease. The folded flag was handed to the general's daughter, and the sharp crack of the final rifle volley echoed across the hills like thunder rolling through memory. John stood a few steps back, hat held against his chest. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the cold air, and for a moment it was 1968 again. He could almost hear the jungle breathing, the soft hum of insects, the distant pop of rifle fire, the weight of a radio pressed against his shoulder as he ran. But memory, he'd learned, wasn't a film reel. It didn't play cleanly, scene by scene. It arrived in flashes, light and dark, honor and guilt, pride and loss. As the crowd began to leave, he stayed behind. There was no hurry. He'd spent most of his life waiting, for peace, for forgiveness, for names to fade from the lists inside his head. The general approached again, now without his hat, his silver hair catching the light. "Didn't think I'd ever get the chance to thank you," he said quietly. John smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd ever live long enough to hear it." They both laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. The general's eyes softened. "Wallace always said you were the one man he couldn't forget. Said you carried more of that war than anyone should." John looked down at his hands, hands that had once held rifles, bandages, friends. Now they trembled only when the past returned too clearly. "I didn't carry it," he said. "It carried me." The general nodded slowly. That's the part no one tells the young ones. They stood there in silence for a long while. No small talk, no medals, no rank. Just two soldiers, one who had risen through the system and one who had simply survived it. Finally, the general asked, "You ever talk about it? To anyone?" John shook his head. "No. Talking doesn't make ghosts leave. It just reminds them where to find you." The general didn't argue. He understood. The breeze moved through the flags again. 100 colors shifting in unison. John watched them ripple and thought about all the years he'd spent being invisible. No interviews, no speeches, no plaques, just quiet mornings, an empty porch, and a small diner down the road that still gave him a free cup of coffee because he looked like he'd seen some things. He didn't need more than that. But standing here now, with the sound of taps still echoing in his chest, he realized that maybe, just maybe, being remembered wasn't about names in stone or medals in drawers. It was about showing up, even when no one expected you to. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun touched the tips of the marble headstones, turning them gold. "Guess we made it, Wallace. Took a while, but we made it." The general heard the words but didn't interrupt. He only placed his hand on John's shoulder again, the same way Wallace once had, half a century ago, in a place no one wanted to remember. The touch said what words couldn't. "You're home, Sergeant. You never stopped being one of us."
The next morning came slow, as mornings do when sleep never really arrives. The house creaked under the weight of time, and light filtered through the blinds in thin, uneven stripes. John sat at his kitchen table, the same one he'd built with his own hands 40 years ago, and stared at the small stack of folded papers in front of him. An envelope, cream-colored, his name written in perfect cursive that only men of a certain generation still used. To Sergeant John Miller. He turned it over, saw the official seal, and froze. The return address read, "Office of General Henry Wallace, retired." His fingers hesitated. The general was gone, so whatever this was, it had been written before that last salute, before the bugle, before the silence. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a letter, handwritten, not typed, and something else, a photograph. He unfolded the letter first. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. "John, if you're reading this, it means I've gone ahead before you, which is fitting, since you always covered me in life. I've thought of you every year since the jungle. You probably don't remember the things you said that night, but I do. You told me leadership isn't about orders. It's about remembering who you stand beside when everything goes dark. I never told you this, but that night changed me. I came home and built a career, but I carried your words into every command, every decision, every man I ever led. You were the best soldier I ever knew, and the world should have known your name long before now. There's a folder enclosed, something I've been keeping for years. Inside are the names of the men you saved on that last day. Not just mine, others too. We found them, John. They lived. Some had families, kids, grandkids. All because one stubborn sergeant refused to leave us behind. I want you to know you didn't just survive that war. You built lives you'll never meet. You carried generations on your shoulders. If I'm gone, promise me one thing. Don't fade away quietly. Tell them what you remember, the good and the hard. Someone needs to hear it, and only you can say it right. See you at the next post, old friend. Henry. John sat there, staring at the page. The words blurred for a moment, not from age, but from tears he hadn't let fall in 50 years. He unfolded the photograph, a black and white image of 8 men standing together, young, dirty, smiling. The jungle behind them looked endless. At the center stood Henry, his arm around John's shoulder. They were both laughing, not because it was funny, but because they were alive. On the back of the photo was a single line, written in the same steady hand. You saved us then. Now save their stories." John sat there a long time, the letter trembling between his fingers. Then he reached for his old notebook, the one filled with grocery lists, repair notes, and phone numbers written decades ago. He turned to a blank page, and for the first time in his life, he began to write. He wrote about the jungle, about the noise, about the faces that still visited him in his dreams. He wrote about courage that wasn't pretty and fear that never left. He wrote about laughter that sounded too loud in the dark and silence that felt heavier than any weapon. He wrote until the sun had set, until the coffee had gone cold, until the words became lighter. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel so empty. For the first time since the war, he didn't feel alone.
Weeks passed. The letter never left John's kitchen table. Every morning, he'd sit beside it with a cup of coffee, reading a few lines again, as if reminding himself that the past was real, that it had weight, but not chains. Word spread through the small town, not by design, but by the quiet efficiency of people who still cared. Someone at the local VA clinic had heard about the letter. Then a reporter from the Veterans Journal called. Then a history teacher from the nearby high school asked if Mr. Miller would speak to her class. John said no twice, but on the third call, he said maybe. He didn't want recognition. He just didn't want the truth to vanish the way faces do when photographs fade. So one Friday morning, he found himself standing in front of 30 students, young, restless, fidgeting. He wore the same suit he'd worn to the funeral, the same pin on his lapel. When he began to speak, the room fell quiet. He didn't talk about battles or medals. He talked about the silence between them, about what it feels like to be 20 years old and suddenly older than time, about what it means to carry someone's memory longer than you carry your own pain. When he finished, no one clapped. They just sat there, eyes wide, still trying to fit his words into their world. A girl in the front row finally raised her hand. "Sir," she asked softly, "were you scared?" He smiled, the kind of tired smile that only men who've made peace with ghosts can give. "Every day," he said, "but fear's not the enemy. Forgetting is." After that, something changed. Once a month, John came back to that classroom. He brought photos, stories, sometimes just silence. The students started calling him Sergeant John. And though he never asked for it, they began standing when he entered, the way soldiers do. One afternoon, as he packed his notes, the principal approached him with an envelope. Inside was a letter, official, embossed. The Department of Veterans Affairs had approved a special recognition for distinguished service and lifelong dedication to the preservation of honor. John chuckled under his breath. Took him long enough. But he accepted it, not for himself, but for the 8 men in that photo. He returned home that evening, folded the letter carefully, and placed it beside the old one from General Wallace. 2 pieces of paper, side by side, one from the past, one from the present. Together, they told a story even history books couldn't capture. That night, as the sky turned the color of steel, he stepped out onto his porch. The wind carried the faint sound of motorcycles on the highway, veterans from a nearby base heading home. He lifted a hand, a small salute, barely more than a gesture. Somewhere deep inside, it felt like someone saluted back. He looked up at the stars, so many, so endless, and smiled. "See you at the next post, Henry," he whispered. Then he turned off the porch light, and for the first time in a very long time, the darkness felt like peace.